The Billionaire Collector's Bride, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Woman in the Frame. She had never been afraid of the dark, not the real kind. The kind that wrapped its arms around you in quiet city alleyways, thick with the reek of last night's sins. She had walked those streets alone 100 times, boots scuffing broken sidewalks, hands stuffed in jacket pockets, stiff with old paint. But this darkness, this absence of time, of sound, of memory, was something else entirely. Elizabeth Voss woke slowly. Her mouth was dry, her limbs leaden, her tongue thick with the aftertaste of chemicals. The air smelled wrong. Lavender and wax, not asphalt and cigarettes. Her eyes opened to a high ceiling painted in gold leaf, a chandelier suspended like a web of glass above a bed too large, too soft, too silent. The sheets beneath her were smooth as river stones, smelling faintly of something expensive and cold. She sat up sharply. Her head screamed with the motion. Light poured through gauzy curtains, diffused like the slow unveiling of a stage. The room was white and gold, ornate and strangely still, with tall windows framing a view of mist-covered mountains. She was no longer in Brooklyn. That fact arrived like a cold slap. Her boots were gone, so was her phone. She wore a thin silk shift, ivory, with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons. Her fingernails were clean. The bruise on her arm, a hand-shaped echo of the man who had grabbed her outside the gallery, throbbed in reply to her pulse. She stood on unsteady legs. The floor was chilled marble, veined like a stormy sky. No sound, no locks on the door, no screams, no chains. Just silence. Ornate sconces lined the hallway, each holding a flickering candle that didn't seem to burn down. Her reflection followed her in endless gold-rimmed mirrors. They lined the corridor like watchers. Then she saw it. At the end of the hall, a painting, and her, not someone who looked like her. Her. Down to the freckle beneath her eye, the exact curve of her lower lip. She stood frozen, staring. The painting was large, oil on canvas, heavy brushstrokes, and she was posed in profile, one hand raised to her throat. Her hair was longer, wilder, and there was a sadness in her face that unsettled her deeply. It was signed in small black letters, L. Vale. Her breath caught. She took a step back. The air shifted behind her. "You're awake." The voice was low, shaped with a European lilt, hard to place. She turned. He stood at the threshold as if he had always been there. Tall, immaculately dressed in black, barefoot on the marble. His features were too precise to be beautiful. Angled cheekbones, a mouth that gave nothing away. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, like weathered stone. She had never seen him before, and yet somehow she had. He didn't move closer. He simply looked at her as though confirming something, that she was real, that she was still here. "You drugged me," she said, and her voice was hoarse, foreign in her throat. "I saved you," he replied quietly, "and brought you here." "Here?" she echoed, stepping back. "Where the hell is here?" He didn't answer. He turned instead, walking down the hall without sound. Not expecting her to follow, but knowing she would. She did. They descended a curved staircase into a vast atrium lit by tall windows that reached to the vaulted ceiling. Marble floors gleamed like wet ice. Paintings lined the walls. Statues stood at odd angles, half-finished, crumbling. Some faceless. A cold draft slid over her skin. He led her into a studio. The room opened like a cathedral. Domed skylight above. Walls covered in canvases, drawings, wooden easels arranged like soldiers mid-march. A single chaise sat in the center, draped in gray velvet. Beside it, a paint-stained stool, and on that stool, a new canvas, blank, waiting. "I don't want to be here," she said finally. Her voice sounded smaller in this place, the way sound vanishes in empty museums. "No," he said, turning to face her. "But you are." She swallowed hard. Who are you? I'm the one who's been painting you, he said simply, long before you existed. She laughed, sharp, humorless. That's not possible. No, he agreed softly. It isn't. And yet, he walked to the nearest canvas and turned it around. Another version of her, this one in blue, nude shoulders, eyes closed, a crescent moon at her throat. She didn't remember posing for it. It felt like she had dreamed it. Or maybe he had. She backed away. I want to leave. You will, he said. When I finished. Her skin crawled. Finished what? Collecting you. He didn't say it with menace. No threat laced his words. He said it like a truth, as if the act were inevitable, ordained. That night, Elizabeth did not sleep. The bedroom she returned to was unchanged, her belongings still absent. But something had been added. A dress, laid across the bed, black, velvet, sleeveless, her size, and on the nightstand a book of sketches, all of her. She opened it with shaking fingers. Page after page, her face, her body, her hair in different styles, her mouth in mid-sentence, her hands clenched, relaxed, bleeding. Some dated years ago, some decades. It couldn't be real. But the paper was warm from the firelight, and downstairs she could feel him awake. Waiting, not watching. Wanting. That was the difference. Elizabeth moved to the window. The mountains outside were shrouded in dark mist. This place was far from anything familiar, but it wasn't a prison made of bars. It was a trap made of velvet and vision and longing. And part of her, some treacherous part, was already wondering what it would be like to be seen the way he saw her. As something already known, already mourned, already his. She let the sketchbook fall shut. Behind her, candlelight flickered. And in the quiet, she felt the start of something she didn't yet have words for. Not fear, not quite desire. Something in between. Something that watched her from every brushstroke on the wall. Chapter 2. The Mansion of Echoes. The morning did not come with sunlight, but with silence. The kind that seems to breathe beside you, patient and aware. When Elizabeth opened her eyes, she did not know if she had truly slept, or if her mind had simply folded in on itself for a while. The air in the room was cold, fragrant with beeswax and something darker, sandalwood maybe, or smoke. Someone had opened the curtains. The mountains were clearer now, their peaks white with snow, the valleys heavy with mist. She rose slowly, bare feet, touching marble that drank the warmth from her skin. A faint memory pulsed at the back of her mind. The gallery in Brooklyn, the sudden hand over her mouth, the sting in her arm. Then this house, the man with eyes like weathered glass. Luca Vale. The name came to her as if it had been whispered through the walls. Her reflection followed her across the mirror-lined corridor, but she barely looked at it. The house stretched outward in every direction, too vast, too quiet, the kind of space built by someone who no longer expected company. The scent of paint hung faintly in the air, mixed with oil and turpentine. Somewhere below she could hear the echo of footsteps, measured, deliberate, unhurried. When she found the source, it was in the studio again. He was painting. The light from the skylight poured over him, turning the black of his clothes into something fluid, silver-edged. He didn't turn when she entered. The brush moved over the canvas in slow, deliberate sweeps, each one so precise it felt like a prayer. I didn't mean to wake you, he said quietly. I wasn't asleep. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. No, I don't imagine you were. There was a pause that stretched too long. He returned to his work. The canvas showed a stormed sea, the suggestion of a figure within it. The face was unfinished, but she already knew who it would become. I'd like to go outside, she said. I need to breathe something real. Then breathe, he murmured. The doors are open. She didn't believe him, but when she reached the glass doors at the end of the hall, They yielded under her hand. The air outside was cold enough to sting, clean enough to make her dizzy. The gardens were wild, not manicured. Trees left to grow into their own shapes, ivy spilling over white stone. The fountain at the center had long since stopped running, its basin filled with rainwater that caught the light like mercury. She stood for a while, letting the wind move through her hair. Somewhere, a raven called, its voice rough and lonely. The mansion loomed behind her like a living thing, its many windows reflecting her image back 100-fold. For a moment she could almost imagine the house watching her too. When she turned, he was standing at the threshold watching her. She hadn't heard him approach. He leaned one shoulder against the doorway, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, assessing. "You don't seem surprised," she said. "At what?" "That I haven't tried to run." "Run where?" His voice was soft, but the words struck something in her. "Down the mountain? Through the forest? You'd be found, eventually. And not by anyone kind." She looked past him toward the house. "You make it sound like I'm safer here." "I didn't say that." He walked toward her, slow and careful, as if approaching something fragile that might startle and flee. When he reached her, he stopped just close enough that she could feel the faint heat of him. His scent, paint, cedar, rain, mixed with the cold air between them. "Then why am I here?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He studied her face as if memorizing each detail anew. "Because I saw you long before you were born," he said. "And when I saw you, I knew you would come." There was no madness in his tone, only certainty. That made it worse. He reached out then, hesitated, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, almost reverent, but her pulse reacted anyway, quickening in ways she didn't want to understand. His eyes lingered on her lips for a fraction of a second before he turned away, breaking whatever fragile thread had been strung between them. "Come inside," he said quietly. "It's too cold." She followed, though she didn't remember deciding to. Inside, the corridors were dim again. The air hummed faintly, alive with unseen movement. Every portrait seemed to watch as she passed, each face caught between sorrow and fascination. She stopped before one that depicted a woman standing in the same garden where Elizabeth had just been. The paint had cracked with age, but the figure's gaze still held the same strange calm. It was her own face again. Same eyes, same mouth. The faint trace of defiance in the set of the jaw. Luca's voice came from behind her. "She was painted on that spot," he said. "Years ago. Maybe decades. She looks exactly like me." "Yes." He didn't elaborate. The weight of that single syllable pressed against her. Later in her room she found the black velvet dress still laid across the bed, though she had left it untouched. Someone had lit the fire in the hearth. The flames threw slow-moving gold across the walls. She didn't know why she put the dress on, only that it seemed expected of her, as if the fabric itself were guiding her hands. When she faced the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. There was a knock, soft, measured. Luca entered without waiting for her to answer. He looked at her for a long moment, not as a man looking at a woman, but as an artist studying light. His gaze moved from her collarbone to the hollow of her throat, and though he said nothing, something in his expression shifted. A shadow of longing, restrained, unwilling to breathe. "You were right," he said finally. "Black suits you." His tone was even, but his eyes betrayed him. The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed. The fire snapped once in the grate, breaking it. "I should thank you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "for not locking the doors. You'd be surprised how many walls don't need locks." He stepped back as though distance were the only mercy left to offer. "Dinner will be brought to you shortly. You need rest." She wanted to ask him to stay. Instead, she watched him leave. When the door closed, she turned to the fire. The flames bent and whispered against the logs, their light catching on the glass of the nearby window. For a heartbeat, She thought she saw her reflection moving out of sync, its eyes lifting toward the doorway before hers did. And somewhere down the hall, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps. They were not Luca's. Chapter 3. The Portrait Room. The days began to merge into one another, slow and weightless, marked not by the passing of time but by the quiet rhythm of Luca's presence. He moved through the house like a shadow made of calm intention, his footsteps soft on marble, his silences filled with thought. Elizabeth no longer tried to count the days. The outside world felt like a fading memory, a half-dream of noise and color that no longer seemed real. The mansion had its own heartbeat, slow and measured, and somehow she had begun to breathe in time with it. He never spoke of why she was there. He painted, sculpted, and wrote in a leather-bound journal that he kept locked. Sometimes she would find sketches of herself left in strange places, her face on a page beside her breakfast tray, the curve of her hand drawn with such reverence it made her chest ache. It should have frightened her, but it didn't. Not anymore. His gaze, when it rested on her, felt less like possession and more like recognition. Still, the tension between them hung heavy in the air, invisible yet palpable, an unspoken thread that pulled them closer with every shared silence. She would feel it when he passed behind her in the studio, the brief warmth of his body brushing the air between them, the faint hitch in his breath when their eyes met too long. He never touched her again after that morning in the garden, but she could feel the absence of his touch as keenly as the memory of it. That evening the house seemed different, its stillness charged as though the air itself was holding its breath. Luca had not appeared for dinner. The maid, an older woman named Marta with a sharp gaze and few words, had simply told her he was working and disappeared before Elizabeth could ask where. Left alone, she wandered the hallways, guided by the dim flicker of candlelight that painted shifting shadows across the walls. The corridors felt endless. Paintings followed her at every turn, women draped in silk, angels with broken wings, eyes that shimmered with life, despite the years. Yet as she walked, she began to notice something unsettling. Many of the faces looked like hers. Not identical, but close enough to stir something uneasy in her chest. A curve of the jaw, a tilt of the head, the same distant sadness. At the end of one corridor, she found a door she hadn't seen before. It was painted black and unmarked, half hidden behind a velvet curtain. She hesitated, listening. Nothing. The handle was cold beneath her hand, but it turned easily, the hinges sighing as the door opened. Inside, the air was still and cool, faintly scented with dust and old varnish. The walls were lined with canvases stacked close together, some covered with sheets, others exposed to the faint light of a single lamp burning in the corner. She stepped closer, brushing her fingers against one of the uncovered paintings. It was her. Again. This time there was no mistaking it. The details were exact. Every line of her face. The small scar near her brow. The faint birthmark behind her ear. Yet the date signed at the corner was 15 years earlier. Her throat tightened. She turned slowly, scanning the other canvases. Every one of them bore her likeness. Different poses, different emotions, but always her. She felt him before she heard him. Elizabeth! The sound of her name in his voice made her flinch. He stood in the doorway, framed by shadow and the faint gleam of the hall beyond. He didn't look surprised to find her there. If anything, his expression was unreadable, though something in his eyes flickered. Resignation, maybe, or sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone low but not angry. "Why?" Her voice came out more brittle than she intended. "Because I wasn't meant to see them? Or because I wasn't supposed to find out you've been painting me for half my life?" His gaze lingered on her face. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." He took a slow breath, stepping further into the room. The light caught his face, softening its sharp edges. "The woman in these paintings isn't you," he said. Her name was Ilara. She lived and died long before you were born. Elizabeth looked back at the paintings, the dozens of versions of herself that filled the walls. She looks exactly like me. Yes, his voice softened. And that is why you're here. He moved closer, his steps quiet, steady. When he stopped, he was near enough for her to see the faint stubble along his jaw, the way the lamplight curved across his cheekbones. When I saw you that night at the auction, he said, I thought I was seeing a ghost. You walked the way she did, tilted your head the same way. It wasn't possible, and yet... He hesitated, eyes dropping to her lips before he caught himself. You were real. The silence stretched, trembling at the edges. She wanted to step back, to put space between them, but her body refused. The pull between them was magnetic, something ancient and unfamiliar, like a thread that had been tied long before she understood what it meant. What happened to her? She asked finally. She disappeared. His voice barely carried. One moment she was there. The next, she wasn't. They said she drowned, but there was no body. I searched for her for years. When I found you, it felt like... He trailed off, then met her eyes. It doesn't matter. You aren't her. But he said it as if he was trying to convince himself. She looked up at him, caught in the strange tenderness that had crept into his expression. His hand rose halfway toward her face before stopping, trembling slightly in the air. The space between them tightened, filled with heat and something dangerously close to longing. Luca, she murmured, not sure whether it was a plea or a warning. His hand dropped. You should rest, he said, voice rougher now, strained. You'll find your answer soon enough. He turned to leave, but she caught the faintest tremor in his composure, the kind of restraint that hurt to maintain. The door shut softly behind him. Elizabeth stood alone in the dim room, surrounded by painted versions of her own face. Each pair of eyes seemed to follow her, echoing the same question she could no longer silence. Was she here to replace the woman he lost, or to remind him that she could never be found again? As she turned to leave, she caught sight of one painting half hidden in shadow. In this one, the woman, Ilara, or maybe herself, was smiling faintly, her hand reaching toward something beyond the frame. The date at the bottom was blurred, but the signature was unmistakable. El Vale, the same as before, the same as always. Chapter 4. Flesh and Marble. The next morning the air was thick with the scent of rain. It hadn't started yet, but the sky beyond the high windows had darkened to a sullen, bruised gray, casting the house in a moodier silence than usual. Elizabeth felt the shift in her chest before she saw it in the sky, as though the weight in the clouds had curled around her ribs. Luca had not appeared at breakfast, but that had ceased to surprise her. The meals always came on time, served by Marta in quiet ritual. A porcelain teacup, silver utensils, cloth napkin, folded precisely. Everything in this house operated with a precision that felt both beautiful and exhausting, as if any sudden movement might crack the illusion of control. And Luca, she was beginning to learn, lived entirely by control. She found him in the sculpture room. It was a colder space than the others, all stone and light and shadow. Windows faced the gray mountains. The floor was dusted with marble powder like ash, and unfinished statues loomed from every corner. Torsos without heads, arms reaching for something unseen, mouths parted in silence. She paused at the threshold, uncertain if she should be here. He didn't look up when she entered. He was working on something small this time, seated at a stone bench. His sleeves were rolled, forearms streaked in chalky white, fingers curled delicately around a slender chisel. The sculpture on the table was a pair of hands, hers. She recognized them instantly, even in the early stages. The left curled slightly inward, the right poised in tension. He had captured the faint crook in her pinky, and the slope of her thumb. It was uncanny. She stepped forward, slow. Her footsteps made no sound on the stone, and he didn't speak. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He paused, the chisel still in his hand. Then he turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. There was something raw in his expression, stripped of polish, almost unwilling in its honesty. "I see the thing I never stopped looking for," he said, "even when I stopped believing it existed." The words landed with weight, not sweetness. She could feel the truth in them, and the ache beneath it. He set the chisel down and rose slowly, brushing marble dust from his fingers. His shirt clung to his back, the faint line of muscle visible beneath the thin fabric. He walked past her without touching her, but she felt him as if he had. The tension in the room changed, sharpened. He stood by the nearest window, watching the storm gather. "I'm not her," she said, and for the first time she felt that it mattered less than it had. "I know," he replied, voice low. "But something in you. It echoes. Not just her face. It's in the way you move, the silence before you speak, the way you look at things when you think no one is watching." "Are you always watching?" "I try not to," he said. "But it's becoming difficult." The space between them thickened. She felt it in her breath, in her skin, the awareness of him. Not just the presence of a man, but the gravity of him. Everything about him pulled her in. The stillness, the intensity, the way he never offered anything he didn't mean. It terrified her more than being kept here, because it didn't feel like captivity. It felt like temptation. He walked back to the sculpture, his fingers brushing lightly over the unfinished marble of her hands. "They're always the hardest," he murmured. "Hands, they carry so much unspoken truth, pain, want, things we never say." "Is that what you're sculpting?" she asked. "The things I don't say?" His lips lifted slightly at the corner, not quite a smile. "Maybe." She came closer, letting herself study the sculpture. It was delicate and exacting, each curve shaped with reverence. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her this way, not just to see her, but to understand her. "You're very good at this," she said, then added, "at seeing things." He didn't answer, but she could feel him watching her again, his gaze tracing over her like paint on canvas. She reached out, fingers hovering just above the sculpture. "May I?" He nodded once. Her fingers brushed the marble, cool, smooth, and trembling under her touch. Or maybe that was her own hand. The thought of him sculpting her, hours spent with nothing but the shape of her body in his mind, sent something unfamiliar and hot sliding through her. It wasn't fear. He stepped behind her then, so close she could feel the heat of him at her back, the rhythm of his breath against her hair. He didn't touch her, but his nearness was a touch in itself, invisible and intimate. The silence stretched again, but this one was different. It hummed with restraint. "If you stay here long enough," he said, voice low, "I'll make you into marble too. And if I don't want to be a statue, then I'll have to find another way to keep you." There was no jest in his tone, no lightness. She turned slowly to face him, her breath catching at the nearness. His face was close, too close, and her eyes found the curve of his mouth before she stopped herself. Her pulse betrayed her. "I'm not something to be collected," she whispered. He leaned in just enough for her to feel the words on his breath. Neither was she. The air between them nearly broke. She felt it, a heartbeat away from surrender. But he stepped back. The distance was small, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that whatever existed between them was still unnamed, still caged by ghosts and memory and whatever darkness Luca had buried behind the walls of this house. Without another word, he picked up the chisel again and returned to his work. The moment passed, but it left its mark. Elizabeth left the room slower than she had entered, her chest tight, her thoughts tangled, and behind her the sound of chisel against marble continued, soft and steady, like a heart that refused to forget. Chapter 5. A room that shouldn't exist. The storm arrived in the middle of the night, not with violence but with quiet insistence. Soft rain at first, then the long, low groan of distant thunder rolling down the mountains like a secret being passed from one shadow to another. Elizabeth woke to the sound of wind pulling at the windows, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if it was the weather or something else. Sleep had become a strange, fractured thing in this place. The house made sounds, breathing sounds, sighing sounds, creaks in the floorboards and faint rustles in the corners where the candlelight never quite reached. She often wondered how much of it was real and how much lived only in her imagination. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and when she stepped out of bed, she saw that the door was ajar. Marta had closed it earlier with her usual silent efficiency, and Elizabeth had never known it to open on its own. She hesitated, then crossed the room barefoot, the hem of her nightdress whispering across the floor. The hallway was dim, flickering with the glow of wall sconces that shouldn't have been lit. No servants passed. The silence stretched too long. She turned left instead of right, away from the studio, away from the familiar, and wandered deeper into the house, following an instinct that made no sense but refused to quiet. The corridor narrowed slightly, the walls pressed closer, and the air shifted again. Cooler, stiller. That was when she saw it, a door. It was set into the stone at the end of a corridor she had never walked before, though she'd roamed much of the mansion by now. It wasn't grand or ornate. It was narrow, wood aged to a near black, the iron handle worn smooth by time. It should have looked like any other door in the house, but it didn't. It felt misplaced. Something not built into the house but buried inside it. She pushed it open. The room beyond was small and strangely untouched by time. Dust floated in still beams of light from a window high in the wall, casting a faint glow across the contents of the room. A child's room. The wallpaper was faded, pale blue, patterned with vines. A small bed stood neatly made in the corner, a wooden rocking horse nearby. Toys sat untouched on shelves. On the far table, a delicate porcelain music box shaped like a birdcage rested beside an oil lamp that had not been lit in years. She moved slowly, reverently, as though any sound might shatter the strange calm. Her fingers drifted across the top of a small writing desk, smudging away dust. There were drawings inside, sketches of birds, stars, a girl with long dark hair. At first she thought the face was generic, but the more she looked, the more familiar it became. It was hers. Again. Younger, rounder in the face, but still unmistakable. A quiet, mournful tune began to play, soft as breath. She turned, heart hammering. The music box had opened on its own. The little bird inside spun slowly, its wings fluttering on delicate wires. The melody was achingly familiar, and yet she was certain she had never heard it before. Then she felt him behind her. Luca's presence was unmistakable now, something she sensed more than saw. Heat, tension, breath. She turned slowly to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that gave nothing away. "I didn't mean to. I know." He stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink around him. "You weren't supposed to see this." "What is it?" she asked softly. "Whose room was this?" He didn't answer at first. His gaze wandered the room with the strange reverence of someone seeing something sacred and painful at once. "Ilara wanted a child," he said finally. "This room was for the daughter we never had." Elizabeth swallowed, the ache of the words catching at something tender in her. "I thought I imagined it," he continued. "I thought it was just grief. But then you came." She stood frozen. Not from fear, but from the weight of what hovered between them. "I shouldn't have brought you here," he said. "Not to this house, not into this past." "Then why did you?" He looked at her now fully, no longer hiding behind restraint. "Because I wanted to know if it was real. If you were real. If the world could be cruel enough, or kind enough, to give me a second chance." The words stole the breath from her. He stepped closer, slowly, as if testing the air between them. She didn't move. "You're not her," he said again, more to himself than to her. "But you feel like something she left behind. His hand lifted, just barely, before falling again. A flicker of control returned to his posture, but it was thinner now, fraying at the edges. "I should go," she whispered. He didn't stop her, but as she passed him their arms brushed, and the contact sent a shiver across her skin. In the hallway she didn't look back, but the sound of the music box followed her, winding down into silence. Later in her room she stood at the mirror and studied her own face, trying to understand what he saw, not just her features but something beneath them, something remembered, something lost. The storm had broken by then. Rain struck the windows in a steady rhythm, soft but insistent. And still, even as she closed her eyes and tried to summon sleep, she could feel him on the other side of the house, awake, watching the past like it might come back to life if he waited long enough. Chapter 6. The Collector's Confession. The next day passed like a dream she couldn't fully wake from. The house, once merely strange, now pressed around her with new weight. Every hallway seemed to hold its breath. Every shadow stretched longer. The air was dense with things left unsaid. Elizabeth moved through it all as if underwater. She did not see Marta that morning. The breakfast tray had been left outside her door, the silver dome warm, untouched. She wandered the west corridor with her hands trailing the velvet-covered walls, trying to forget the small, aching room she had discovered the night before. But the melody of the music box still haunted her, faint and persistent, like a whisper echoing from the spine of the house. The studio was empty when she found it. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, softened by drifting dust. His work waited quietly, sketches fanned across the table, charcoal pieces resting near half-finished studies of her body. A painting sat drying near the window. Her face again, this time turned slightly upward, eyes closed as if listening for something just out of reach. She stepped closer. The detail was obsessive. Her skin caught in mid-light, her lower lip parted, throat bare. There was something intimate about it, almost too much to look at. Not the image of a woman being observed, but of one remembered. He was behind her before she knew it. "I didn't hear you come in," she said quietly. "You were somewhere else." Elizabeth didn't turn. She could feel him standing near, his breath slowing to match hers. "You painted me like that before we ever met." "I dreamed you before I ever saw your face." His voice was lower now, heavier as though it cost him something to speak. She turned to him then, slowly, and found him watching her with that same unsettling stillness, like a man peering through a window at a life he couldn't quite touch. "I don't know what's real anymore," she said. "You talk like you've known me for years. You look at me like I already belong to you." He didn't flinch. "Because part of me believes you do." The words, quiet and bare, settled between them like ash. He stepped closer, and this time she didn't move. The space between them closed until there was nothing but breath and tension, thick and coiled. She felt the pull again, that slow burn gravity she no longer had the strength to resist. "I was 22 when I painted the first image of your face," he said. "I remember because it was after Alara died. I couldn't sleep. I tried to draw her, but it wasn't her who came to me. It was you. A stranger I hadn't met, wouldn't meet. But there you were, in pencil, in ink, in color." His hand lifted, hovering near her face, trembling with restraint. "I thought I was losing my mind, but the sketches kept coming. Always you, always the same face. And every time I thought, if I ever find her, if she's real, I won't let her go." He touched her then. Not fully, just the edge of his fingers brushing her cheekbone, trailing downward like a thought barely formed. It was the gentlest thing, but her body lit with the heat of it, her chest tightening, her lips parting on instinct. She closed her eyes and then, abruptly, the phone rang. The sound shattered the moment, jarring and sharp. He stepped back with a sharp intake of breath. the cold returning between them like a slammed door. Elizabeth's eyes opened slowly. Luca crossed the studio in silence and picked up the handset mounted on the wall. He didn't speak, just listened. His jaw tightened. Then a name spoken flat and low slipped from his mouth like poison. Nico. He hung up without another word. Elizabeth's pulse was still racing from his touch, her skin alive in places he hadn't even touched. But his posture had changed completely. Shoulders squared, expression carved in stone. She knew somehow this was not a name plucked from nowhere. Who is he? Luca didn't look at her. My brother. The words were leaden with history, with weight. He walked past her, pausing only for a breath. He's not supposed to know you're here. Then he was gone, and just like that, the fire they'd been circling so carefully, so slowly, was doused in cold air. She stood there alone, the quiet ringing louder than the storm, and somewhere behind it, beneath the tension and the secrets, she still felt the ghost of his touch, still burning, still unfinished. Chapter 7. The Brother Returns. It rained through the night and into the morning, as though the sky itself had grown heavy with the secrets buried in the walls of the house. Elizabeth sat by the window wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of cedar and oil paint. She had not seen Luca since the phone call. The storm seemed to have swallowed him whole. Outside, the trees bowed beneath the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. The sky hung low over the mountains, gray and unbroken. Every corner of the estate felt tense, expectant, as if the house itself were waiting. When the knock finally came, it was not soft. The front doors groaned open with a force that seemed almost theatrical, and the sound echoed through the corridors like the start of something that could not be undone. Elizabeth didn't rise, but her breath caught as footsteps entered, heavier than Luca's, uneven in pace. She heard voices, not raised, but sharp, clipped, slicing through the stillness. She left the window and moved toward the hallway, instinct drawing her like a thread. From the top of the staircase, she saw them in the foyer. Luca stood motionless, hands at his sides, face composed but taut, like a canvas stretched too tight. Across from him, the newcomer cut a very different figure. Taller than Luca, broader, his dark coat soaked with rain. His presence didn't belong to the house, it crashed through it like a storm made of flesh and iron. His features were similar to Luca's, but rougher, more weathered, carved in blunt lines. There was no stillness in him, only movement, tension, appetite. Nico. She didn't need to be introduced to know. His energy was different from anything else in the house. He belonged to the world outside the marble, outside the velvet, something violent and raw that she thought she'd escaped. And then his eyes found her. He smiled, but it wasn't warmth that curved his lips, it was recognition, amusement. So, he said, voice carrying easily, this is the ghost. Luca didn't flinch, but his silence deepened. Elizabeth felt the air shift around her, growing colder. Nico walked toward the stairs, slow and deliberate. She stayed at the top, unwilling to move. She's real, Nico said over his shoulder. I didn't think she would be. I thought maybe you'd finally lost your grip, brother. Painting your fantasies into flesh. He looked up at her again. His gaze wasn't crude, but it was invasive in a different way, like he was looking for cracks to pry open. You look like her, he said. Too much like her. Elizabeth remained silent. There was no space in her throat for words. Luca stepped between them at last, breaking the line of sight. His back to her, his voice quiet but heavy. She's not yours to speak to. Isn't she? Nico replied. Isn't she just another piece in your collection? Luca said nothing. The silence that followed was more violent than any outburst. Later, the tension hung in every room like smoke. Nico had settled somewhere in the east wing, bringing with him a kind of noise the house had forgotten. Music played faintly from a room she hadn't entered before. Doors shut harder. Footsteps carried farther. Elizabeth stayed in her part of the house, but her thoughts were tangled now. Luca's confession still lingered, raw and strange. He hadn't touched her again, hadn't even looked at her since that moment, as though he feared that if he did, something would break beyond repair. She found him again in the sculpture room. The light was dimmer now, cloud-filtered and pale. The sculpture of her hands had progressed, details emerging, the faint bend of each knuckle made real. He was bent over it, jaw set, shoulders drawn tight beneath his shirt. He didn't look up when she entered. She approached slowly. He didn't stop her. "He thinks I'm just another one," she said. "Another girl to replace the one you lost. I don't care what he thinks. But is he right?" Her voice cracked, too quiet. "Is that what I am?" Luca straightened but still didn't turn to her. "No," he said. "You're not a replacement." She waited. The silence pressed harder. He finally turned, and for once he looked tired. Truly tired. Not the kind that came from lack of sleep, but from years of holding something too heavy for too long. "You're not a Lara," he said. "But you're not nothing either. I don't know what you are to me yet. I just know I can't seem to stop needing to look at you." The words caught in her like a hook. Not sweet, not rehearsed. Just the truth. Raw and aching. He stepped forward. The distance between them had always been measured. Tonight, he crossed it. His hand rose again, this time touching her face with a softness that undid her. His fingers brushed her jaw, her cheek, tracing the shape of her without hesitation now. Not claiming. Not consuming. Just knowing. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch. The breath left her lungs in a slow, fragile exhale. Her own hand rose, instinctive, and pressed lightly to his chest, feeling the warmth of him beneath the fabric, the slow, careful beat of his heart. He didn't kiss her, but he looked at her the way some people pray, and that was worse, and that was everything. And the moment held, stretched, trembled. Then he stepped back. "You should rest," he said, voice low, uneven. "He won't stay quiet for long." She nodded once, turned, walked away on legs that felt uncertain. She didn't sleep that night either. The house had changed again. A new energy had entered, something louder, something colder. But beneath it, between the storm and the silence, something else had finally begun to bloom. Not memory, not obsession. Something living, something real. Chapter 8. The Second Alara. The days that followed unfolded in a different rhythm, one that felt more delicate than before, as if the house itself sensed a fracture forming beneath its foundations. Nico's presence shifted the atmosphere, pulling something darker into the light. He prowled the corridors like he owned them, leaving the smell of smoke and whiskey in his wake, as if his very being refused to be subdued by the quiet elegance that Luca had so carefully preserved. Elizabeth avoided him when she could, retreating into the rooms where silence still lived, where Luca's touch lingered in the air, even if he wasn't there. The studio became a sanctuary again, not because it offered answers, but because it offered presence, paint-stained air, unfinished canvases, and the sense that the man who haunted her thoughts might walk through the door at any moment and look at her the way he once did. But something in Luca had pulled away. He hadn't touched her since that night in the sculpture room, hadn't held her gaze as long, hadn't lingered in the spaces between their words. The weight of his brother's return had changed him, tightened his jaw, shortened his silences, pressed shadows into the lines around his eyes. She watched him from across rooms, wanting to reach through whatever wall had formed between them, but knowing instinctively that if she pushed too hard, he might vanish entirely. It was Marta who gave her the key. The housekeeper had grown quieter since Nico arrived, her movements more precise, her eyes more alert. She never spoke unless necessary, but Elizabeth could feel something building behind her measured glances. One morning, when the storm had finally passed and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and iron, Marta left something folded between the pages of a book Elizabeth had left near her breakfast tray. A photograph. Faded. Edges curled. A woman, standing in the garden Elizabeth knew so well. The marble fountain visible in the background. Vines climbing the stone wall behind her. The woman's face was unmistakable. It was her face or Ilara's. She turned the photograph over. A date was written in narrow script. 20 years ago. Beneath it, a name she had never heard before. Father Rinaldi. She found the priest's name again in one of Luca's library books, scrawled inside the front cover of a leather-bound catalog of stolen paintings. No explanations, only initials, a symbol in the shape of a key. She waited until the house grew quiet that evening, until Nico's laughter had faded behind the far wing doors and Marta had disappeared into the service corridor. Then she followed the winding hallway behind the library shelves, the one she'd never noticed before, where the wallpaper changed to dark velvet and the floor grew uneven with age. At the end, she found a door that opened into a narrow room filled with old monitors, stacked tapes, dust-covered shelves, and the humming quiet of something long forgotten. She didn't know what she was looking for until she found it. One of the tapes was marked with a single letter, E. She slid it into the old player and pressed a button without thinking, the screen flickering to life with a hollow crackle. The footage was black and white, grainy, a hallway. She watched as a figure entered the frame, female, long hair, slim silhouette. The walk was unmistakable. It was hers, or it should have been. Ilara. Elizabeth stared as the woman moved across the screen, pausing near a window. She looked afraid, glancing behind her before slipping into a nearby room. Moments later, another figure followed. A man. The image was too distorted to see his face, but something in the way he moved, confident, silent, made her stomach twist. The tape cut out there, nothing more than static. Elizabeth stood frozen, heart beating in her throat, the silence around her too complete. She pressed eject, held the tape in her hand like a relic, and turned slowly, knowing before she looked that she wasn't alone. Luca stood in the doorway, eyes unreadable, one hand braced against the wall. You weren't supposed to see that. She didn't speak. The weight of the image still pressed on her chest, thick and cold. You said she vanished, she said eventually, her voice low. You didn't say she was chased. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was no anger in his face, only fatigue. She was taken from me, he said, voice stripped of its usual polish. Not lost, not run away. Taken. By who? I don't know. But she saw it in his eyes. He had always known, or had always feared the answer too much to speak it aloud. Nico, she whispered. Luca said nothing, which was worse than any confirmation. He wants to take me too, doesn't he? This time Luca's gaze broke. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time, she saw the man beneath the sculptor, beneath the collector, beneath the haunted perfection he wore like armor. This man was not in control. This man was trying not to break. I won't let it happen again, he said. Not to you. She moved to him then, without needing to understand why. She reached for his hand and found it trembling. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a vision, not as a memory, not as Ilara, but as herself. I'm not her, she said, but I'm here, and I'm still breathing. He cupped her face then, finally letting the tension drop. His thumb brushed her cheek, his touch reverent and unguarded. The silence between them thickened, heavy with all the things neither of them had the words to say. She leaned into his hand, into the moment, and when his forehead touched hers, it was not an act of seduction but of surrender. Whatever had existed between them before, ghosts, dreams, shadows, this was different. This was real. His voice, when it came, was barely a breath. You changed everything." And for once she believed him. They stood there in the dark, two people no longer pretending not to need each other. And outside, somewhere beyond the stone walls and locked doors, the wind began to rise again. Chapter 9. Fire in the Gallery. The morning came brittle and golden, sunlight catching on the marble floors like glass, but the beauty felt hollow. The house, once heavy with secrets, now bristled with something more immediate. Tension that scraped at the walls, tightened every breath, unsettled the quiet. Elizabeth woke with Luca's warmth still etched into her skin, though he had already slipped away. There had been no words between them after last night, only the slow fall of his head against hers, the press of his hand against her back, the kind of silence that meant everything. She had slept with that closeness wrapped around her like a second skin. Now she rose with the knowledge that something had shifted, though she didn't yet know whether it was a beginning or an ending. The corridors were too quiet. Marta was nowhere in sight. The smell of smoke, faint and foreign, drifted through the east wing, and though she told herself it was the hearths, the scent felt wrong, acrid, deliberate, unsettling. When she turned the corner into the main hall, she saw the door to the gallery cracked open. She'd never been inside. Luca had once told her the collection was private, paintings gathered from years of obsession, some of them stolen, some of them salvaged, many of them never meant to be seen by the public again. But there had always been something reverent in the way he spoke about it, as though the gallery was the beating heart of everything he had ever loved or mourned. Now smoke curled from the edges. She moved fast, the silk of her dress whispering against her skin, bare feet catching on the cold stone as she pushed the door open. The heat hit her first, low, smoldering, wrong. The fire wasn't visible yet, but its presence was undeniable, a growing pulse in the room. And standing in the center of it all, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair damp with sweat and fury, was Nico. He didn't look at her. His hands were steady, methodical, pouring something clear and sharp across the canvas of one of Luca's oldest paintings, Ilara, draped in white, her face turned in profile. The same face Elizabeth saw in the mirror every morning. "Don't," she said, but her voice came out too soft. He struck the match anyway. The canvas erupted into orange and gold flames, eating through paint and linen with startling hunger. The fire spread fast, leaping to the others nearby. Portraits, landscapes, figures half-rendered in chiaroscuro shadow. The light from the flames danced across Nico's face, casting him in something both furious and cruel. "I told him this would happen," Nico said, still not turning. "You can't keep building altars to ghosts and expect the living not to bleed for them." Elizabeth stepped into the room, the heat rising around her. Smoke clung to the back of her throat. Paint cracked and blistered as the fire raced upward. It was destruction, yes, but it was also something else. Cleansing, maybe. Madness. "What do you want?" she asked, louder now, though her voice still shook. "I want him to let go," Nico said. "Of her. Of this house. Of everything she left behind. Including you." His gaze met hers then. Not lustful, not greedy, but certain. "You're not Ilara, and no matter what he thinks you are, you'll end up just like her. Gone. Burned into something he can never touch." The fire hissed behind him. She saw the edge of the frame catch, Luca's latest painting of her, the one he hadn't shown her yet. She didn't think. Her feet moved before her thoughts could catch up. She rushed forward, past Nico, into the rising wall of smoke, arms outstretched. The heat lashed at her skin, the acrid stench of burning varnish turning her lungs raw. But she found it, the frame still intact, the canvas blackening at the edges. She pulled it from the wall, the wood scorching her palms, and stumbled backward, breath ragged. Nico didn't stop her. "I thought maybe you'd see it by now," he said, voice dull behind the smoke. "But you're just another girl in his collection." "No," she said, coughing. "I chose this. I'm not a reflection. I'm not a memory. I'm real." Behind them, the gallery doors slammed open. Luca. He crossed the space like a storm, eyes locked on his brother, face unreadable but burning with something deeper than rage. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The brothers stared at each other for a long moment. And in that silence, Elizabeth saw something old and ruined between them. Love twisted into rivalry, grief warped into resentment, a lifetime of losses they had never healed from. "I warned you," Luca said at last, voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "And I saved you," Nico replied. "Once. Don't make me regret it." Luca turned to Elizabeth then. She held the painting close, arms trembling, smoke curling around her like a ghost. Their eyes met and she felt something break open between them, something that had nothing to do with the past. She dropped the painting. Let it fall into the fire. Luca didn't look away. When the flames licked the canvas and devoured it, she stepped toward him instead, closing the space that had always been there, but never crossed. "I'm not her," she said again, "but I'm still yours, if you want me." His eyes flicked down to her hands blackened with soot, then back to her face. He reached for her then, no longer careful. His fingers curled behind her neck, his mouth found hers with the force of all the words they had never spoken. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was desperation, hunger, truth. The fire burned on behind them, paintings turned to ash. The ghosts faded. But in that kiss there was no past, and only now, only them. Chapter 10. The collection is complete. The fire was put out by dawn. What remained of the gallery smoldered in silence. Charred walls, ash where once there were faces, glints of shattered frame gilding scattered across the floor like discarded relics. Smoke still hung in the corridors like an afterthought, curling in corners, drifting under doorways. But the house did not mourn. Not truly. If anything, it felt lighter. Marta moved through the ruins without speaking. She cleared away what she could, doused embers in corners no one had noticed, opened windows that hadn't been touched in years. She didn't speak to Elizabeth, she didn't need to. In the hush of the aftermath, there was an understanding. Something old had ended, and something else, something uncertain but alive, had taken its place. Elizabeth stood in the studio, hands still darkened from the night before. Her dress was ruined, the hem torn, the bodice singed, but she didn't feel the need to change. The room felt untouched by the chaos. Sunlight poured through the skylight, catching the pale canvas nailed to the center wall. It was blank again, stretched and ready. A beginning. She was tracing the edge of a palette, her thoughts still wandering through smoke and memory, when Luca entered. He looked different in the daylight. Not softer, but real in a way that felt new. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, shirt open at the throat, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. The control he wore like armor had been stripped away by the fire, burned to ash with the last of his ghosts. He said nothing at first, just looked at her, and she looked back. There was no need for apology, no explanations. What they had survived had nothing to do with words. He moved toward her slowly, and she let him come. When he reached her, his hands found her waist without hesitation, pulling her into the space he'd once kept between them. She exhaled against his shoulder, not quite a sigh, more like a surrender. Her palms pressed against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. Steady now, no longer burdened by secrets. "You stayed," he said, the words a rasp against her temple. "I chose to." That was all. And it was enough. He kissed her with the kind of slowness that unravels. Not demanding, not desperate, just deep, certain. A man who had waited too long to feel something real, finally allowing himself to want it, to want her. She melted into him, arms wrapping around his neck as his mouth moved over hers with aching deliberation. His hands slid down her back, fingers tracing the lines of her spine, her hips as if learning them for the first time. There was no rush in the way he touched her, no greed, only reverence. They moved through the house together, his hand in hers, their footsteps echoing quietly over marble and stone. He led her not to the bedroom where she'd once felt like a guest, but to the west wing, where sunlight slanted through long-forgotten windows and ivy grew unchecked against the glass. A room left untouched, a room neither of them had claimed until now. The bed was unmade, the sheets still scented with lavender and linen. She lay back against them, and he followed, shedding the last of the distance between them. There was no need for words. Their mouths spoke in glances and touches, their bodies answering questions neither had dared to ask out loud. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt as he kissed her throat, the curve of her shoulder, the edge of her collarbone. His name slipped from her lips, not a cry, not a command, but a promise. He moved slowly, carefully, every inch of him pressed to hers as the rest of the world fell away. The air around them shifted, warm and thick with the kind of closeness that cannot be undone. She had never known that desire could feel like quiet, like home. Later, long after the sunlight had faded to gold, she lay curled against him, tracing the line of his wrist with her fingertips. His arm was draped around her, fingers tangled in her hair, his breath steady and warm against the back of her neck. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It pulsed with something lighter now, something unnamed, but understood. "You're not in any of those paintings anymore," he murmured. She turned her head slightly, eyes meeting his in the dim light. "No," she whispered. "You never finished me." "I wasn't supposed to." He kissed her again, softer this time, as if to seal it. In the weeks that followed, the house changed with them. The east wing was closed off, the gallery doors locked, its ashes swept away. The studio reopened with a new canvas. The sculpture of her hands was finished and placed in the garden, where ivy would someday claim it. They didn't leave the villa. Not yet. The world beyond the mountains could wait. What they had was still new, fragile in its blooming, but real. And here, in the silence they now shared, it could grow without interruption. Elizabeth began painting again, not for survival but for herself. Sometimes she painted him. Sometimes she painted the places between dreams. Sometimes she left the canvas blank and let the sunlight do the rest. And Luca, for the first time in his life, stopped collecting. He didn't need to, because the only thing he had ever truly longed to possess had chosen to stay, not as an object, not as a muse, but as his. And this time the frame remained empty, because no masterpiece needed to be caged to be complete.